Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman Family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman Family JCC is an incubator for new expressions of Jewish identity. It creates innovative Jewish learning, celebrations, and arts programs that inspire personal connections to people and ideas from across the Jewish world. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 159, Judaism Illuminated. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rothberg.
And we are continuing our series exploring creativity and its role in the future of Judaism. This series has been put together with the Council of American Jewish Museums, and I'm excited to be facilitating a panel with our previous three guests, Aaron Henney, Yishai Hussidman, and Ivy Barsky, at the Council of American Jewish Museums conference in Los Angeles this coming weekend. We're going to release the audio from that panel as soon as possible, and it's a really interesting example of how we can try to bring some discussion among our guests on Judaism Unbound, so we're really excited about your feedback on that format. This week's guest is part of that series, although he won't be appearing on that panel. Our guest today is one of those guests who actually needs no introduction, but I'm going to give one anyway. Novelist Jonathan Safran Foer is the author of Everything is Illuminated, Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close, and his most recent novel, Here I Am, which was published in 2016. In 2016, Jonathan Safran Foer was also named by the Foer newspaper as one of the 50 most influential Jewish Americans of the year. In addition to his work writing novels, Jonathan Safran Foer wrote a book of nonfiction in 2009 called Eating Animals about the factory farming industry. We're going to speak about that, as well as a lesser-known book called Tree of Codes, which we're going to discuss as part of the episode. We're really excited to have him here on Judaism Unbound. Grateful to the Council of American Jewish Museums for making the connection. So, Jonathan Safran Foer, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's a thrill to have you.
Thanks for having me.
So we're doing this series of episodes with the Council of American Jewish Museums where we're specifically looking at creativity, and I thought that we would start in a kind of dangerous way, which is to talk about the one of your books that I have not read. It's called Tree of Codes, and I actually wanted to read it, but it was super expensive on Amazon.com. I think there's only a small number in print, and it's a book in which you took another book called Street of Crocodiles by Bruno Schulz, and you literally cut it up. If you open the book, there are all these holes where sentences and words would go, and you cut out various words and sentences to take that book and create a new book of your own out of the very same material. It actually reminded both of us of Thomas Jefferson's Bible, where he also cut out passages and put them together in a way to try to tell the whole story and take out various supernatural events, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm curious about how you, in this book and in your novels, go about the process of taking an existing work or going to the past and mining it in the service of the creative process.
Well, I think that the question might imply more premeditation than there actually is. I certainly don't, when I'm either conceiving of a project or working on a project, I don't really think about preserving or maintaining or exploring or undermining or reimagining. I just don't think about what I'm doing in those terms. And in fact, and this, it might sound like I'm joking, but I don't really think about things at all. The ways that people often describe the creative process don't have a lot to do with the way that I experience the creative process. For me, it doesn't happen in the language of literary criticism, and it doesn't happen even intellectually. It's much more visceral, has to do with, or feels like it has to do with instincts, sometimes even just reflexes, like I'm drawn to this, so I go to that. Something else turns me off, so I move away from it. And, after the fact, after I've written a book, I can look back and try to answer questions in those terms and try to, say things like, well, this is why I might have chosen Bruno Schulz's book for that project, or this is what the erasure of it might mean. sometimes it feels not like a lie, but not like the truth. The truth is I do what I do almost always because at the time it was the thing that I wanted to do. And that might sound circular or overly simple or naive, but I very rarely feel that I'm choosing among many different options, some of which would be great but require bravery, some of which are fairly straightforward but won't be as exciting. For me, I feel very lucky to be working on any project that I feel an investment in. I find it hard, frankly, to care about something enough to want to work on it intensely over time. It's not that hard to be excited about a novel for a day or a week or a month. It's very hard to be excited about a novel over the course of several years. And not because novels are so unusual. Everything is like that. Whatever your job is, friendship is like that. Relationships are like that. Everything is like that. It's hard to maintain a really high level of engagement consistently over time. So when I find something that does inspire that kind of engagement, first of all, it's usually very rare. And secondly, I don't feel like I have the luxury of making all that many choices about it. I tend to just feel grateful to have it and push on it.
I have a question that I'm sure you get whenever I have a version of a question that I'm sure you've gotten before when speaking with Jewish institutions, at Jewish institutions, et cetera. And basically, I mean, it's not going to shock you and it won't shock our listeners who have read any of your work, but Jewishness, Judaism, et cetera, are not hidden in your books. They're very present. And I'm curious, then this relates to some of what we've talked about already. I'm curious whether it is sort of a conscious, planned out thought process, how Judaism ends up manifesting in your various books, or alternatively, if it simply manifests because you as a Jew are writing from your intersection and that is part of it. I'd love to hear just how you conceptualize Jewishness, Judaism, etc., Jewish identity, all of these terms that we throw around, how those play into your books, and maybe also, to the extent this is helpful, ways that they don't.
There are a lot of things that have surprised me in my writing over the years. I mean, really, honestly, just about everything has surprised me, at least in the most basic sense of I've never written the thing that I thought I was going to write. I've been a writer now for a while. I think I've written 5 book proposals or so from publishers, and I've never turned in the book that I proposed. So I always get sidetracked or find something is more interesting than what I had thought I would work on, or what was going to be one chapter becomes the entire book. The thing that has surprised me most in this surprising career has been the way that Judaism keeps surfacing. Not even necessarily the way, but the amount that it keeps surfacing. Before I wrote my first book, Everything is Illuminated, I don't know that I felt particularly Jewish, whatever that even means, which is a question unto itself, but I wasn't observant. If you had asked me, do I care about my Jewish identity? I probably would have said yes, but I wouldn't have known how. If you had asked me if I was interested in Eastern Europe, if I would want to read a book with a description of Everything is Illuminated, I'm not sure I would have said yes. I definitely wouldn't have guessed that I would write that book. And then I did. And it's, resolutely Jewish. There's kind of no debating that. So I have found that maybe because my writing is not really subject to lots of premeditation, maybe because it's such a visceral or instinctive process, things that matter to me deeply, as opposed to things that maybe I am aware of, or things that more consciously matter to me. The things that matter to me deeply tend to find their way in. Sometimes they are big cultural things. Sometimes they're almost fetishistic things, just like I find that I am interested in walls, or I find that I'm interested in things that change shapes. It's all kinds of aesthetic examples. But then there are also philosophical examples, intellectual examples, cultural examples, and religious examples. And Judaism, I'm still not observant, but I have a very strong Jewish identity now. I think that most of that identity is experienced through writing. That might sound like, well, that's a very limited kind of identity, except that writing is my whole life. I spend the majority of most days alone writing, which is to say I spend an awful lot of time engaged with that identity.
We had a guest a couple of weeks ago who's a painter named Yishai Hussidman, and most of his painting is not about Jewish subjects, but he has painted one series, of late that's about the Holocaust. And it was interesting to talk with him as somebody who hasn't had a lot of Jewish content in his work, in his body of work, and now all of a sudden does, and he mentioned this idea, well, this might be the first and only Jewish piece of art that I ever make, compared to you, who it sort of seems to be a sort of a recurring theme. And I'm wondering if it matters, or if you think that there's something to the question of whether somebody is a Jewish artist, or to the extent to which it's important or not important to sort of place their art into the building of a Jewish culture versus that their art lives in the larger culture, the American culture in which you live, and there are Jewish themes in it.
I can entirely understand why that is a question that would interest somebody. I don't know that it's a question that interests me.
Mm-hmm.
And what I mean by that is not that I think it's an uninteresting question. I mean, it's just not how I approach writing. Like if I were a basketball player, I can imagine that there are people who would find the question of technique incredibly interesting, or that a physical therapist might find a basketball player's reliance on his heels very interesting, but that doesn't have a lot to do with the way that basketball is played. And again, like I don't think about my writing in the way that I think a lot of readers might, or frankly, in the way that I might think about other people's writing. I don't know, and I don't especially care if people think of my books as Jewish or how they fit into a larger Jewish conversation. Or maybe a different way of putting it is, I find that's not helpful when I'm writing. I find the most helpful thing is usually to drown out such, or to avoid or repress questions like that, and instead to, try to, as authentically as I can and without anything mediating it, express myself. Some things will come out in that expression that are interesting to different people for different reasons, and a lot of things will come out that aren't interesting to anybody for any reason. But that is kind of after the fact of having made it.
I love that you're amplifying this. And it came across in both Dan and my questions, right? That we took for granted something that you're pushing back on, and I appreciate that. But I wanna name that this doesn't only happen with respect to you or with contemporary fiction or any, like, I think we do this more generally with Judaism. We look back at whether it's some holiday that exists or a ritual or a story or whatever, and we presume a great deal of intent. We presume, to use a Hebrew term, kavanah, we presume that it was thought out and it was created to achieve a particular end goal. Yep. When in fact that may not be how it's happened. But I do kind of like that we do that. I like that these rituals exist and then we retroject intentions onto them. It's hard to do that with the authors themselves, and maybe the hundreds of years of history helps us to do that because they can't argue with us. But I guess I'd love to turn a little bit to one of your most explicitly Judaism-connected, Jewishly influenced works, your Haggadah, the New American Haggadah. And because that's a text that maybe not in your work, but the Haggadah more generally does have a set of, I think, end goals, at least how some people orient to it. I'm curious whether you'd approach that work similarly to how you've talked about your more narrative works, or if it's a different category of your work in your mind.
Right. So let me say a few things. One, I agree with you that I enjoy that kind of pulling apart of a text or a ritual and finding meaning in it and seeking intention. It would be dishonest to pretend that when I'm making things that I'm thinking in that language. Like I enjoy thinking in that language about other people's creations or about other artifacts, other things that are in existence. And I have no idea what their creators were thinking when they created. In terms of the Haggadah, that really was a different kind of project. That was not just following instincts and, oh my gosh, I ended up with the Haggadah. That was maybe my most intentioned book. And it was inspired in the way that you would probably guess. Just I was at a Seder and found that it was sort of disappointing at least because of how great it could and should have been. This sort of singular gathering of family around these singularly important and interesting themes. And it's so reliant on the book, the kind of user's manual for the holiday, the Haggadah, that I thought, well, why not try to make one? And in this case, it really didn't require any chutzpah. This is something that many, 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 many people have done for many, many, many years. It's the most rewritten book in history. It's the book that has the most editions made of it. So to say like, hey, I'll try to make a Haggadah is to say almost nothing at all. My parents have made them. I think my older brother has made one for his Seder. And it was a very different kind of process for me than any of the other things that I've written.
So for folks who haven't seen that Haggadah, I'd love if you could give us a sense of what it is, what it does. And I guess I'd love to hear more about what was disappointing. Like what was the gap? And we don't have to like say which Seder you at and like, oh, Shlomo led a terrible, but what was the gap that you perceived maybe in that particular Seder or more generally in Passover Seder, such that you felt not only that you wanted to make a Haggadah for you, but like to put out to the world? And how'd you go about doing that?
The gap was simply that why wasn't the conversation living up to the subject? Like the themes are so profound, so universal. Slavery, freedom, our obligations to each other, to the other, what is a stranger, what does the perpetual movement toward freedom look like, toward home look like? There has never been and there will never be a time when those aren't just wonderful things to talk about. Then I found that our conversation just felt kind of ho-hum. And I loved the people who were surrounding the table, and I loved the earnestness with which we joined together, and I loved what we were there to talk about. But I just didn't love how it was experienced. And so that was the sort of basis. And then in terms of my approach, it is a book that I edited, not a book that I wrote. So a lot of what the book is the result of conversations. For example, Oded Ezer, who is the designer of the book, the design is extremely influential, or important to the experience of the book. The various voices in the book. I have what I feel like is a good sense of what is important to me at a Seder, but I'm also not a scholar. And so I also leaned on people more knowledgeable, and we just sort of assembled it as we went, and it changed quite a bit as we went.
I mean, it feels like there's something in what you're describing that's inherent in the challenges that I have with any Haggadah, including this one, but every Haggadah, which is that I think that the process of making it is the truly important piece of all this, right? That almost like the idea of reading out of a book and trying to sort of create a ritualized, a ritual experience out of that is it feels like a second best to the process of writing your own book. And it's interesting to hear you describe this process of your writing this book, which it feels like. I'm curious actually whether the experience of whether you've had seders with this book, with your own Haggadah as the book being used at the seder, and whether they have been the seders that you dreamed of, or whether really it was creating the Haggadah that was the seder that you dreamed of.
That's a very good question. And yes, I have used it. And yes, it has not been the kind of be all end all experience. And you're right. It was the making of it that was the sort of like ultimately rich experience for me. I used it at theaters, and it was nice. And there were things about it that worked really well, and things about it that didn't work terrifically well. But I did get the most gratification from making it.
I think this question is a little bit related to what you've been describing in a way as the difference between the process of creating your books and the process of people experiencing them or attributing or wanting to know what you were thinking and that kind of thing. The other book of yours that I had not read until recently was Eating Animals, your nonfiction book about the factory farming industry. And I actually read it because I was watching some interviews with you online to prepare for this interview. And there was one in particular where I felt like you kept trying to say something about that book and the interviewer kind of wasn't interested and would switch the topic to something else. And then you would kind of try to bring it back. And I said, well, I want to read this book because I think that this is a book that you want to talk about. So I don't know if you still want to talk about it, but I have to tell you that I found it to be this sort of profound work of Judaism that it worked for me as a work of Judaism, right? In the sense that it was also kind of the way that I wish I generally experienced Jewish conversations, which is that there were principles that we really believe in and care about. And now we have to sort of confront the world and see whether our principles are being lived up to by ourselves. And if we find that to be wanting, we should do something. And in many ways, that feels like the point of the Seder as well. So I'm curious about your experience putting that book together and its reception, whether there's something sort of in that about the general experience of somebody creative who has a different sort of sense of the output from the input.
Well, I expected to really find the experience to be a drag. Who wants to first of all, who wants to think about meat? Generally, it's a very uncomfortable subject. It's just not fun. At its best, it will inspire you or most people to feel motivated to change, but change is itself not an easy thing. And there's a lot of room for just kind of feeling guilty and crummy, not to mention as a writer being bogged down. One of the things I most value about writing is freedom and the ability to just move in any direction I want at any time I want. And I couldn't do that with this book, both because I had a subject from the beginning that I wanted to pursue, and because I had to be truthful. And, being truthful required doing an awful lot of research and having the case that I was making or the writing, you could say, stifled by that burden to be accurate and honest. As it turned out, I absolutely loved writing the book, and I found it to be really expressive and very emotional in certain ways. As for the reception, it's kind of hard to say because, everybody who I speak to, it's a self-selecting audience. People don't really come to readings because they hate your book. People come because they like it. So as a writer, you get this false impression that, people like things more than they actually do. Also, vegetarians or simply people who make an ethical change in their lives tend to feel good about it. And vegetarians aren't so unlike Jews, frankly, for a reader. It's an audience that believes in what it's doing and is proud of what it's doing. Otherwise, it wouldn't exist. Nobody forces you to have a Jewish identity. Nobody forces you to want to be a part of a Jewish community or larger culture. So as a writer, to be a part of that in any way, to engage with that, is usually a very positive experience. So I met an awful lot of people who seemed to be moved to change their lives because of the book. It's, Mark Twain once said, there's nothing easier in the world than quitting smoking. I've done it 50 times. It's very easy to become a vegetarian or to change how you eat. It's very hard to maintain that change over time because there's so many incentives not to. So I have no idea, how many people that come up to me and say, oh, I became a vegetarian because I read your book. I have no idea how many of them stick with it, but I feel proud of the effect that book had in the world. I feel at least as proud of that as I do of any of my other books.
I mean, so I'm a vegetarian, not as a result of your book. I wish I could say that. That would be a cool moment on this podcast. But,
well, you could say it.
Right. But what's so interesting. I mean, given the conversation we've had thus far, I'm actually reflecting on myself because people ask me why I'm a vegetarian. And it wasn't like I sat down and weighed pros and cons one day and like made a big decision to become vegetarian. It was actually the way it played out. It was very much connected to my Jewishness. I was connecting to some ideas about Jewishly, what one should or shouldn't eat. And it just like intersected enough with vegetarianism that sort of made sense to me and was also like a more straightforward way to talk about it to people. But so I'm curious, partially because selfishly I want to be able to answer that question better. But like, I'm a little curious if you could give us, and those who didn't read that book, a little kernel of your argument. I think that would be really helpful. And to the extent that and even if it doesn't, directly connect to ideas you think of as, or others would think of as Jewish, like, why is it that we should care about this issue of eating meat? And why did it call you, somebody who mostly has been writing fiction, to take on that issue?
Well, one of the points that the book makes is that I can share what moves me, but we each bring something quite unique to the table. Familial culture, religious culture, appetite, body, all kinds of things that kind of can't be shared and aren't necessarily open to argument in the ways that we normally think about, the relationship between lifestyle and ethics. Food is extremely complicated. And I think an important first step in talking about the ethics of eating is to respect that, and to respect that what's easy for me might be hard for you. What's hard for me might be easy for you. What matters to me might not to you. What doesn't matter to me might matter greatly to you. And the book spends a fair amount of time talking about that or exploring it. I think that it is wrong to harm animals unnecessarily. I don't approach that from a perspective of thinking that animals are equal to humans. I don't approach it from the perspective of thinking that animals need rights that resemble the rights that humans have. I mean it in a very basic way that I believe is probably a universal value, or at least approaches a universal value. It's very, very hard to imagine the sane person who would be completely indifferent to somebody violently kicking a dog for no reason. Like, I think we can agree that nobody presently in this interview and nobody listening to this interview is going to be perfectly indifferent to that. We would say, all things being equal, I don't like that. That shouldn't happen. Similarly, whether one believes in human-caused climate change or not, and my strong assumption is that everybody on this podcast and listening to this podcast does believe in that, we certainly can all agree that we need the air that we breathe to be clean, relatively clean. We need the water that we drink relatively clean. We need for there to be forests. We value nature. We need our planet to be habitable. So we know, not through opinion, but through well-established fact, through ample documentation over a long time, that our present system of animal agriculture, which is not the same as the system of animal agriculture we had 75 years ago, but our present system of animal agriculture is the worst thing that humans do to animals. It causes an enormous amount of unnecessary animal cruelty, and it's the worst thing that humans do to the environment, and is significantly more important than a lot of other things that we think of as being important with regards to the environment, like what kind of car we drive, or whether we wash our clothes in hot or cold water, or whether we recycle. These things are small potatoes compared to the choices that we make every day as eaters. So there are good farms in the world. There are farms that don't harm animals, or rather they kill animals, but they don't make them experience unnecessary suffering. And there are farms that are perfectly sustainable environmentally. The problem is, in the year 2019, more than 99% of the animals that we eat are raised on what are called factory farms, where animal suffering is the rule and environmental degradation is the rule. Not that it sometimes happens, but it's the business model. If we don't want to have make a 3 times a day contribution to animal cruelty and environmental degradation, then we need to just pull back as much as possible from that industry. And there are a lot of ways of pulling back. Vegetarianism is one. Another is to buy meat at a farmer's market where you know the farmer and can go visit the farm and can see with your own eyes what we're talking about. Another is not to think of this as such a binary, but instead not to sort of measure one's distance from some kind of imaginary ethical perfection, but instead to take steps in a direction that feels good to you. Like, I'm not going to eat meat on Shabbat because it is just totally not in keeping, totally antithetical to the values that inspire me to observe Shabbat in the first place. Or I'm not going to eat it for lunch because lunch really isn't that important to me. Like, usually at lunch, I'm just eating whatever's near at hand to sort of get full enough. Whereas it's at dinner when I eat with my family or eat with my friends or prepare a meal over the course of, more deliberately over the course of a longer time, that matters to me. And there are all kinds of ways to approach this problem, but we really have to agree that there's a huge problem, and we have to, each of us, perhaps in our own ways, take steps to work against that problem.
I appreciate how you describe all this, because as I'm listening to you talk, I'm thinking about sort of what may have been the project of the biblical writers at their time, or of the writers of the Talmud at their time, that these are folks who are using a mix of fiction and nonfiction, right, to try to explore some of the issues that are on their minds, right, that they're noticing, as you described, and some of the issues that they think are the most important issues. And it's interesting when you think about how something like factory farming would have been just absolutely inconceivable, right? I mean, there's nothing really in Judaism explicitly to deal with this, because it's something new and at a scale that those folks just could never have dreamed of and imagined. And it's interesting to think about how we have to address a task like that in our time through fiction and nonfiction, right, to try to wrap our minds around what our task is as human beings.
Yeah, and I also think there probably are things inside of Judaism that know how to address this. Like, most people, I'd be curious how you guys feel. Most people think there's an ethical component to kashrut, that it's not just an arbitrary set of dietary guidelines that we follow because they're there, but that there's something behind them that's worth feeling proud of and that isn't arbitrary. And I think that, the idea of the moment of slaughter being painless and instant, or the insult added to the injury of, cooking a calf in its mother's milk. So, those are all obviously quite interpretable. But again, I think most people feel that there is an ethical component there, that Judaism recognizes that eating is a moral act and something that requires carefulness. And that's really, I think, the point here is just, are we being sufficiently careful? It's not, are we being perfect? It's not, can we wear a slogan on a t-shirt? It's, does this feel sufficiently careful to me?
I loved your question, like if that's how we conceptualize it, whether kashrut has an ethical component. I think it relates back to this strange theme that I didn't anticipate of initial intent, original intent, to use like a constitutional term, versus like retroactive intent. Because it's not clear to me that in terms of what the Torah's authors were getting at, what whoever fashioned this system was getting at, it's not entirely clear to me that they meant it to be an ethical device in the way that we think about it now. What I am sure of, despite that, I am positive that one can today, and people have for at this point many hundreds of years, ascribed a certain intent to it that I think is great and that I think can be utilized to enhance our own ethics today. And so for me, it is less important what the initial intent was than it is how we can mobilize, a set of teachings that exist ultimately, and how we can ascribe intent in ways that will make us better as individual human beings and allow us to make the world better writ large. But what's so funny about that is it sort of takes us full circle. And so I'm curious, given that we're floating now in this hilarious mesh of like kashrut and the overarching question of how intent works initially and retroactively, like, can you help us whirl this together? Are these two questions separate, or perhaps do they weave together in all of the various books that we've talked about that you've written?
One thing I talk about with my students is, many of them are working on different projects at the same time. I have 40 pages of a novel about this and 2 short stories about that. And I've been thinking about trying to do a novel about this. And what I will often say to them is usually concurrent projects are the same project, however different they might seem. At the very, very least, right, they're all coming from the same source. I think that people have different concerns, and religion and art both engage with our deep concerns in ways that I don't know that anything else does. And sometimes the concerns seem disparate until they are brought into the same kind of framework of understanding. Eating animals and my last novel, Here I Am, might seem to be as different as 2 books could be. But I think they're different expressions, very different expressions of very similar concerns, which, not to oversimplify it, have to do with the question of how to live. What is a good life? How do you define what a good life is for you? How does your personal definition interact with your sense of what it means to be a member of a community or civilization? And what happens when your understanding of what a good life is in conflict with your ability to live it? Looking back at everything I've done, I think I see, in a way, a kind of record of my own, not necessarily answers to those questions, but my own asking of those questions.
As we arc to close, just the only last question I have is really, it's designed for all of those out there listening. It's less about what I'm curious about, and more just, given that you have made some contributions where, like you described with the Haggadah, you saw a disappointment, you saw a frustration, a gap, and you sought to take steps artistically and Jewishly to create something new and powerful. What would you say to people that look out at their synagogue context, at some other institutional Jewish context, at Judaism writ large, and say, you know what, I feel a disappointment too, and I want to go about creatively addressing it? How would you encourage them to go about that process, artistically or otherwise, given that you have taken it on in certain senses yourself?
I think that sometimes we spend too much energy worrying about the right way at the expense of participating at all. It sort of like goes back to what I was saying about vegetarianism. These things aren't binaries, and it's not only a mistake, but a tragic mistake to measure our distance from perfection. Like, how can I completely recreate my community? Well, is that the question, or is that a question that's likely to inspire action and change? Or is it better to start with, the first step of, here's a specific thing that doesn't feel right to me. Here's a specific way that I can address it. It's a good place to start.
We need good places to start. So thank you so much, Jonathan Safran Foer, for joining us. It's been a great conversation.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it.
And thanks so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and we hope that you'll join us for the very end of our unit on creativity. We're sad to see it go, but it is closing out next week. And as a reminder, Dan is going to be at the Council of American Jewish Museums conference, and we hope that those of you in LA will be able to go, and those of you who aren't in LA will tune into it as a bonus episode following when it is recorded. So we want to close out this episode in the same way that we always do, by encouraging you to be in touch with us, and there are a wide variety of ways for you to do that. First, you can head to our Facebook page, Judaism Unbound. Second, you can head to our Twitter feed at Judaism Unbound. Third, you can go to our website at judaismunbound.com. And last but not least, you can always hit us up via email at dan@judaismunbound.com or lex@judaismunbound.com. The last request we love to make is that we really deeply appreciate any amount of financial donation you're able to spare, and you can do that at judaismunbound.com/donate with either a monthly recurring gift or a one-time donation. So thanks so much for listening, and with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.